There is no doubt that the development of terminology for African languages is relevant to the development of African languages and therefore to the Africa we want, if the potentials of the African peoples are to be fully recognized and exploited for a peaceful, prosperous and integrated Africa. Terminology development plays an indispensable role to language empowerment as it has been done with other languages such as English, French, German, Mandarin and Japanese, to mention just a few. The Vehicular Cross-Border Language Commissions of the African Academy of Languages, ACALAN, one of its working structures, have all identified terminology development for African languages as part of their priority areas. In its mission to implement its mandate of developing and promoting African languages so that they can be used in all the spheres of life in Africa, ACALAN organized a workshop to develop a methodological framework on terminology development for use in African languages in July 2010, in collaboration with the University of Dar es Salaam in the United Republic of Tanzania. Meanwhile, in July 2014 in Nairobi, Republic of Kenya, a meeting was subsequently organized as a follow-up to the Dar es Salaam workshop, which made improvement on the earlier meeting because it was a result of the presentations at the Nairobi meeting that the manual entitled Principles and Methods of Terminology Creation and Use in African Languages, ACALAN 2015, was produced, whose objectives were to determine the needs and rules to follow in the development of terminologies and compilation of dictionaries in African languages. Realizingly, ACALAN, in its attempt towards the implementation of the practical aspect of the recommendations of the Dar es Salaam and Nairobi terminology workshops, and to revisit the framework in view of adjusting it to a more comprehensive one, held another consultative meeting on terminology development for African languages between the 23rd and 24th July 2019 in Bamako, Mali. The Executive Secretary of ACALAN, Dr. Lang Fafa Damfa, in his welcoming remarks, underscored the essence of terminology development as a key measure for language development. He emphasized the need to develop African languages, to empowering them to becoming real working languages, official languages and languages of instruction, alongside the former colonial languages.
We will sit together, make suggestions, in other words, draft the document. We'll say this one should be there, this one should be there, this one should be there. After launch, immediately, this technical committee that I called will be just a few people who would sit down to look at it, to fine-tune it, so that we will come up with something presentable. And then after all this, when we have the document, then this committee, it can be a committee of a few people, 4 or 3 people or something, would go back and look at it again to present. If you look at the language plan of action for Africa, there is an introduction, there is an objective and principles, then you have priority domains, and then you have action plans, what the member states should do to be able to implement this language plan of action for Africa. And he's telling them you have to mobilize resources for this. You have to do this, you have to do this. So this committee would sit down and look at other policy documents together with the Secretariat.
He outlined the objectives of the workshop as follows: to revisit and consolidate the methodological framework to develop terminologies for African languages, to consolidate and advocate for use of the harmonized orthographies in African languages, to pave the way forward for the development of terminology, among others, and to bring the language dimension into the discourse in the education system. Emeritus Professor Ayo Bangboshe at the meeting underscored the need to use already existing blueprints, and especially the ACALAN 2015 Principles and Methods of Terminology Creation and Use in African Languages, as a basis for the review and consolidation of new frameworks, and the need to adopt an all-stakeholders approach terminology development, in which subject area specialists, linguists and speakers, as well as other strategic partners, collaborate and work together in terminology development.
We're looking at concepts rather than the terms themselves. The concept we're looking for is a term is created, it gets into the language, that is insertion. But what we have been using the term dissemination for is, how do we make this new term spread? It must spread if it's going to remain in use. And the way to do it is to use it. You use it in different domains. It so happens that when you create terms, some will die. I give the example, and I've given it often. When people started doing terminology work in my language, they referred to a radio as that machine which speaks but does not wait for a reply. That's the translation. The machine that speaks but does not wait for a reply. So that means that term did not spread. So it means that that's the end, it will die. The other one is the one that will be in use. Whatever term you use, please let it catch the concept.
Presentations were made by participants mainly on the principles, methods, procedures, approaches, dynamics, and challenges of terminology development. The recommendations of the consultative meeting are the following. There should be a positive, supportive, inclusive, and enabling language policy environment to support terminology development in African languages. A special summit should be organized to monitor progress on the implementation of the demands of provisions of the Language Plan of Action for Africa as far as the formulation and adoption of language policies are concerned in the African Union member states. Sustained lobbying and advocacy activities should be carried out around the need to implement the letter and spirit of the demands and provisions of the Language Plan of Action for Africa. Terminology development should be considered as an inclusive all-stakeholders initiative and a cross-cutting inter-multidisciplinary activity. Terminology should be institutionalized in higher education where these activities are already being carried out in a coordinated manner. Unprecedented ICT innovations in terminology development should be embraced and informal terminology development initiatives acknowledged. The whole exercise of terminology development should be recast, rebranded and repackaged as language intellectualization as a measure of creating a buy-in. The scope of rewarding and incentivizing terminology development initiatives through awarding prizes, even for non-literary works and contributions, should be broadened. Success stories should be used as launch pads to inspire future projects and create buy-in. There should be financial support from ACALAN for terminology development initiatives. Advantage should be taken of the fact that most African languages are cross-border vehicular, and in order to cut costs and avoid reduplication of efforts, there is need for collaboration in terminology development endeavors. New existing strategic collaborative partnerships should be developed and old ones maintained for leveraging knowledge sharing and mobilization of resources. Terminology models presented by the experts during the expert presentation session should be adopted and adapted. A technical committee for terminology development to make the recommended adjustments was set up with the following members: Professor Langa Kumalo, Professor Tapelo Otlegetwa, Professor Marcel Diki Kidiri, Professor Kimani Njogu, Professor Alu Keita, Professor John G. Kiango, Dr. Selemani Sewangi, Mr. Isiaka Balo, Dr. Aseta Diallo, Dr. Ivundho Ndlovu, and it was agreed that the team will circulate a call for book chapters, develop author guidelines, set timeliness, and be responsible for receiving all the submissions, managing the peer review process, and editing of the manuscript. The manual should carry the title Principles and Methods of Terminology Development in African Languages, and the content to include background, objectives, formatting of the manual, principles of terminology development, and others that will make the manual publishable for the end users.
And national structures would come there to try to work out this working document and to forward it to UNESCO and to forward it to ACALAN, and then ACALAN would forward it to UNESCO to present this thing to the United Nations as the African Regional Meeting Working Document, so that the activities which would start in this year would go along to try to empower this language. This corresponds to ACALAN's mandate, ACALAN's vision, and our mission as well. Our mission is to empower African languages and to try to use them as languages of instruction, to use them in all domains of our society. And the idea of indigenous languages, that's why I said to UNESCO, is that all African languages are indigenous, because they are the languages of the natives of Africa.
It is pertinent to note that the meeting brought together stakeholders which include members of the ACALAN Assembly of Academicians that are specialists in terminology development, experts in terminology and lexicography from ACALAN's working structures from the 5 regions, ACALAN's institutional partners, UNESCO, SIL International, OIF, the Caranta Foundation and resource persons, staff of the ACALAN Secretariat, and members of the government of the host country, Mali.